Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Richard Maybury, who's become a fairly regular guest on this show. Always glad to have him with me because of his history, his knowledge of history, which he brings into the present realm and helps us understand what's going on now in the context of what has happened centuries in many cases in the past. And it's very valuable because I really think that Americans, of course, I think that Americans are being dumbed down by their educational system. I think we'd probably be better off if we didn't have any state schools at all in terms of our knowledge of what has actually transpired, because I think we're getting a picture of what's going on that isn't at all apropos. So we turn to Richard Maybury. I'm not going to read his bio now because he's been on this show many times in the past, but I would suggest that you go to richardjmayberry.com, richardjmayberry.com, to go to learn more about Richard's service, and really consider subscribing to his newsletter, as I do, because it's one of those things that I think if you realize that what goes on in today's world is interrelated with what goes on in the rest of the world, and then understanding the history of that and why what's happening is happening, it is very, very valuable. So thanks for joining me again, Richard.
Oh, it's good to be here, Jay. I always enjoy talking with you.
It's always fun to talk with you as well, and I want to make sure that email or that website is correct. That's Richard J. Maybury. Is that right, Richard?
I don't know about the J, but for sure, richardmayberry.com works.
Okay, well, if you just Google that, you'll get his you'll get his website. I was just looking at the back of your newsletter. I know I go there sometimes, but I bookmark it, so I couldn't tell it was a J or an I. But in any event, I wanted to make sure. Richard Maybury, be sure to check out his work and subscribe to his letter, because it's a very inexpensive letter. It comes once a month, and it's just chock full of a lot of very valuable information. Well, Richard, China and Russia, in general, the BRICS, have been seeking, in particular, the more powerful members of the China and Russia for sure, and China most of all, have been seeking to become more important in the world community. But global institutions like the IMF, which is dominated by the United States and the UK, have refused to grant China more power and more say-so in the IMF. And recently, they requested that their currency, the yuan, be included in a basket of currencies that comprise the SDRs. The IMF said no, that China, you still have a lot of work to do. Go back to work, and maybe sometime in the future we can consider you as being a member of the club. But what do you think prompted China, though, just, this last week? They did a 4% devaluation of their currency, and I was looking at some statistics today, Richard, that suggested that China is still, on a trade-weighted basis, 30%, their currency is 30% above the other emerging markets in terms of trade-weighted. In other words, it's overvalued vis-a-vis the other trade-weighted the other emerging markets, and they attach themselves to the dollar, more or less, and have floated with the dollar, and of course the dollar has gained vis-a-vis the other currencies. But do you have any thoughts about what might have prompted China to do that? Certainly trade would be one thing, I would think, but what are your thoughts? Have you given any thought to this devaluation?
Yeah, right. One thing to start with is the understanding that these sorts of decisions in a government are almost never made by a single person. This is the decision of a committee, and we all know that committees are pretty difficult to trust if you have any common sense, because every decision they come up with is some sort of compromise. So you want to see this as a bunch of politicians in a room arguing with each other, and the compromise they came up with was this devaluation. There could have been politicians in that room that actually wanted to value the yuan up rather than down. There's just no way to know. So the other thing that ties in here is that what goes on in these sorts of meetings is that these are human beings, and they have emotions, and they have pride, and they have all sorts of other things that psychologists talk about, and that's all mixed in here with it. They're not a bunch of Star Trek Vulcans making this decision. They are human beings with emotions, and the emotions in these deals generally dominate. And what drives them is mostly fear. Each one of those persons is afraid of something in the economy, but they might be afraid of different things. So, you got this mess, which is a political meeting, and it came up with this decision. And that's all we really can say about it, is it's driven by fear, and each of these people have different fears, and they came up with this compromise. So, I generally try not to analyze political thinking because it's hopeless.
It's such a mess, in other words. It's
right.
Not,
it's ridiculous.
It's rational from each person's self-interest, perhaps, from their point of view, but not necessarily from a national point of view.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that is another point. I mean, each of these guys is thinking in terms of his own best interest. He's a politician, and he makes decisions that he thinks will benefit him the most. So that's mixed into these sorts of decisions too. And that result is, the only thing you can say with great confidence is that the thinking behind any decision in any political committee room is irrational. That's all you can say about it. You don't know any more than that. So, why they did it, I haven't got the foggiest idea.
Well, there's all kinds of speculation. It certainly is true, though, that, with a weaker currency, at least in the short run, would give China an advantage. We're hearing all kinds of reports. I don't know, again, what you can believe, but there are reports coming out of China that their economy is much, much weaker than what the politicians are letting on. And there is some evidence of that, I think, in terms of trade data and so forth. But there's no doubt that a weaker yuan, at least in the short run, immediately would probably have some benefits, except then you might have a sort of a beggar thy neighbor 1930s style competitive devaluation, wouldn't you? Possibly?
Yeah, right. What you're doing there is you're going through the opinions of the various people in that political room right now. And you can go, well, this might happen, and that might happen, and this could go that way, but nobody really knows. What we do, I think what we can be extremely confident about is that China is the biggest mountain of malinvestment ever in world history. Now, what do I mean by malinvestment? Most people keep track of investment. I try to keep track of malinvestment, and that means investments that are in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing, that just should not have been created. And the way malinvestment generally happens is that a government will inject money into the economy. It'll print a bunch of it up and go out and spend it on something. So that new money is injected into the economy. It goes into, it doesn't descend on the economy in a uniform blanket. It goes into specific locations. Those locations become hotspots, and businesses move into those hotspots to take advantage of these increased flows of money. And those businesses moving into these hotspots are malinvestment. They are going where they would not have gone if the inflation of the money supply had not happened. Well, then the businesses are there. After the government has been injecting money for a while, the businesses are there. They are dependent on that increased flow of money. And the day will come when the money will flow elsewhere, and these businesses will start going broke. Or the government will just stop printing the money or slow the printing of the money. In one way or another, the malinvestment will start to shake out. And that's what we call a recession, or if it's allowed to go all the way to completion, it's called a depression, is the shakeout of the malinvestment. Now, I think what's going on in China right now is the malinvestment is starting to shake out. And I think the Chinese government has done so many artificial things to pump up its economy over the last, let's say, 30 years, that mountain of malinvestment is a genuine Himalaya. And it is starting to shake out. And I bet you those people in that room, those politicians, are scared out of their minds. They don't know what to do other than keep manipulating the currency and try to find ways to keep having currency flow into the hotspots to keep the malinvestment alive. And that's essentially the decision that they're all batting around in this room probably on a daily basis. And what do we do today about this malinvestment that's starting to shake out? Mm-hmm. And I think I would guess, I don't know for a fact, but I would guess that there is an air of panic in that meeting room, and they will be trying one thing after another, none of which will work because the malinvestment is there. These skyscrapers are there. You've probably read about the ghost cities in China. Entire cities have been built that are practically empty. And that's an example of the malinvestment that they have created. And nobody in history has ever come close to doing something that awful on that large of a scale.
Yeah, it's absolutely true, Richard. You know that in terms of the quantitative easing, so-called quantitative easing, which of course is a misnomer. It's inflation. It's printing press money that sends the wrong signals, sends artificial signals, and hence the malinvestment that you're talking about. I don't know if it was Warren Buffett or whoever came up with the notion of the picture of when the tide goes out, we see who's swimming naked, and that's certainly when the tide goes out. And when we've seen the tremendous amount of oil and other commodities that were purchased, steel. We're in a depression in some of those industries now. Australia, the countries that are producing those raw materials are having a heck of a time. So it is a global problem that we're having now. Just after the 2008-2009, we saw an expansion, in large part because of this Chinese, malinvestment and buying all of these things that helped to pull, I suppose, some of the markets out of the doldrums. But now, because they're not sustainable, because they weren't market-driven, we're starting to see this huge outflow, and we're seeing who's swimming naked. And I suppose that a large number of Chinese folks are swimming naked right now. But in any event, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the petrodollar. Richard, when Nixon took us off the gold standard, Nick Kissinger, shortly thereafter, went to Saudi Arabia and arranged to have oil paid for in U.S. dollars, and that has come to be known as the petrodollar. And I was just watching something, Lawrence Wilkerson, who is a distinguished visiting professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary and former chief of staff of Colin Powell, Secretary of State when he was Secretary of State. He said the BRICS want to use oil to force the United States to lose its incredibly powerful role of owning the world's transactional reserve currency. Now, talk to us a little bit, if you would, about the importance of having the world's reserve currency. What has that meant for the United States? And to what extent do you think this is the wars that are being fought? I know that wars are fought, as you point out in your newsletter, going back centuries. People hate each other in different parts of the world, and that's been aggravated by various superpowers coming in and mixing things up and making things even worse. But to what extent do you think the U.S. the U.S. and the NATO alliances are continuing to get involved, try to stop Putin from selling oil to certain parts of Europe or what have you? Do you have a sense that the wars are in part related to this maintenance of the petrodollar and the world's reserve currency by the United States?
I think it's a factor, no doubt. You want to see the behavior of any given government as the same as the behavior of the leaders of a street gang. They want to maintain control of their turf, and they will do anything that it takes to maintain control of their turf. So, they are always scared of some other gang taking over their turf, and they will do what they can to hurt that other gang. And in the world, we've got 206 countries, which means we've got 206 governments or 206 street gangs trying to control their turf and keep the other 205 in each case from taking over their turf. And if that means wrecking somebody else's economy, they will do it in a heartbeat. and that's what this currency war that you're referring to is really all about. Is they're just trying to keep all of their competitors weak. In any case, any government, they want their competitors to be weak, and they will manipulate anything they have to, the currency or anything else, in order to keep their competitors weak. And I think these the maneuvers to try to remove the dollar as the world reserve currency. That's definitely involved in this in some way, in some big way, probably. It's just going to be interesting to see how it turns out. The one thing is for sure is that the dollar, at this particular moment in history, is a popular currency and a trusted currency for people's savings in millions of cases. But it's really just the most beautiful warthog in the herd, and that will change. And what these other governments are doing is trying to hurry it up. The advantage of being the reserve currency is that other people in other countries will accept it in trade for your goods and services, and they will use it for their own savings. And so you can pay your debts in money that you can print.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not the reserve currency, you can't do that because you've got to pay in the reserve currency in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only the person who issues the reserve currency that can print money to pay his debts. And that's what the U.S. government has been able to do through most of the 20th century and all of the 21st century, is print money to pay its debts all over the world. Well, if the government of Russia and Iran and whoever else succeed in getting together and removing the U.S. privilege of being the reserve currency, then the government is stuck with not being able to print money to pay its debts, and then it's going to have to either tax us much, much more heavily to pay its debts, or it's going to have to default on the debts. There will be some type of catastrophe in the United States. So it's really easy to believe that these politicians in these other countries are forming some sort of conspiracy to do that. But again, we don't know what goes on in those rooms, and they can change their minds the next day. It's just you really are fooling yourself if you think you can predict the behavior of a government, because
yeah. Yeah, exactly for what you say. So you have all of these street gangs, 100 and some nations that you mentioned, but within each street gang, there are a bunch of guys that are trying to cut each other's throats to take over and be the top dog in those within those street gangs.
That's right.
And it's right. Ultimate chaos is what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. One very interesting question that I have for you, Richard, and I don't know, nobody knows exactly what the numbers are, but there's lots of indications. In fact, I think the People's Bank of China came out recently and doubled the official amount of gold that China has. And there are people that keep track of these things, like Koos Jensen and others, that are suggesting that China has imported enormous amounts of gold over the last number of years, far, far more than what the People's Bank of China is suggesting that they have, and I believe that to be the case. But again, if you try to, you just can't figure out what the thinking is there, though. But if China is trying to do that, if they are importing huge amounts of gold, the official numbers are showing also that Russia is doing the same. We know that Indians import enormous amounts of gold, and more recently silver, when they put on taxes onto the importation of gold there. Mm-hmm. So you have these BRICS that seem to be pro-metal, I don't want to give them any credit for being free market types that believe in sound money. I don't think for a minute that that's the case.
Yeah.
But maybe they're seeing or perceiving some advantage in this currency war against a prolific printing West. I mean, not that we're worse than China, for goodness sakes, but do you have any thoughts about why, if indeed that's the case, I believe it to be the case, that enormous amounts of gold is being transferred from the West to the East? James Turk has always pointed out that the gold generally flows, to the countries that are becoming more prosperous. But in the meantime, if we're having a global recession, who knows? But any thoughts about the penchant for owning gold in the East?
Well, it's an old custom. One thing to be aware of there that most Americans have no understanding of is that the governments of Europe conquered during the colonial period for many centuries. They conquered almost the entire world except for 5 countries, and that was Afghanistan, parts of China, Japan, Thailand, and Iran. Except for those countries, they conquered the entire world, and so pretty much the entire world hates the West.
Yeah.
And doesn't trust the West. Well, we've got all these international bodies, economic bodies like the IMF, and these, and the World Bank and all. These are inventions of the West. So, the rest of the world looks on these bodies with a great deal of suspicion, and they look on the currencies with a great deal of suspicion. So they have always, in Asia and elsewhere, had the tradition of saving gold because the West can't print gold. Mm-hmm. You can't make it on a printing press like you can dollars or euros. And there have always been huge amounts of gold and silver that have been hoarded in Asia because of this distrust and hatred of the West. And I think, the main thing to keep in mind about it is that those people are hoarding huge amounts because they always have. That's part of their culture. But you don't know how much or where or who has it or what they're going to do with it. We just know it's over there. And that any rational person would be owning some gold and silver himself because there is this stability to it that governments are never going to be able to create. There's just no chance that any government is ever going to be trusted as much as the metals are because these are elements. They're on the periodic table. They cannot be created out of thin air. And I don't know what to say other than that.
Yeah. Well, that's fair enough. I think you presented very, very rationally, of course, and there's reason to want to own a non-political monetary money so that it retains its value, as you say. I want to get your thoughts about something that John Kerry just said recently. First of all, your thoughts on the nuclear arrangement with Iran that President Obama is trying to get through Congress. Is it a good idea or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, these are Iranian politicians and American politicians and other politicians making agreements with each other. So we've got a whole bunch of liars that have made an agreement. And should we be concerned about that? I don't know. But how can you really put much credibility in an agreement among a group of liars? I don't know. All we can probably be sure of is that they're all going to stab each other in the back, and that's about all we can say.
I just thought it was interesting because John Kerry is making the point. I mean, this could be just nothing but internal politics to try to put pressure on Republicans to go ahead and get this agreement passed for Obama's legacy or whatever his own interests are. But Kerry is making a deal about. He says, "What are you?" Somebody raised the question about, if U.S. Congress turns this down, should we then force our allies not to trade with Iran? And he said, are you kidding me? Are you really kidding me? I mean, first of all, we got these our allies to sacrifice a great deal by not trading with Iran, and then we turned down, and the Iranians have done what we've asked them to, and we in America turned down this deal, and then we go to our allies and say, you can't trade with Iran now, and we're gonna punish you. And he said, if you guys want to fool around like that, we may in fact be on the precipice of losing our reserve currency status. So this is the first time I've heard any sort of high-ranking politician talk about in those terms and with those kinds of threats about losing our reserve currency status. But I thought that was very interesting, and maybe it's just nothing more than Kerry playing internal politics, trying to force a few members of Congress to vote with the Obama situation. Who knows? But I just thought it was very interesting. Any thoughts on that?
You're right. There you got the street gang mentality, and I think we come back to the fact that each of those politicians in that meeting room has his own personal agenda that he's going to be pushing, And we don't really know what those agendas are because they're not going to disclose them. So I don't know what else to say besides that.
Yeah, well, good enough. I want to thank you very much for being with us. One thing that we didn't get to talk to about today is velocity of money. And I know that you in your last newsletter talked about velocity of money. I, as an Austrian thinker, do believe there is legitimacy to that, even though it smacks of Keynesian economics. I agree with you. But the whole notion of turning over, when people lose confidence in the monetary system, they try to hang on to what they've got, or if they see inflation coming, they'll start to spend just to get something tangible in their hands because they know that the currency is going to go to zero. And we've been on this low velocity binge, and it continues to go lower. I see we're out of time, so I guess we'll have to reserve your thoughts about this for the next time, Richard. But I would say, folks, go and read Richard's newsletter if you want to know about monetary velocity and why it's important. All these other things we talked about, much, much more. You heard a little bit today about Richard's sense of history and how it comes into the present. So thank you very much, Richard, for being with us. I'm sorry we're out of time. We'll talk to you again sometime soon, I hope.
Thanks very much, Jay.